In this lecture, we will start thinking about and learning about the executive branch. Now, when we think of the executive branch, we think of the presidency. More specifically, we think of the president as an individual, a person. Boy, do we have lots of them. This small song that is part of this PowerPoint might help you keep them straight, though it's a bit dated.
Hi-ho, do you know the names of the U.S. residents who then became the presidents and got a view from the White House loo of Pennsylvania Avenue?
George Washington was the first you see. He once chopped down a cherry tree.
President number 2 would be John Adams, and then number 3.
Tom Jefferson stayed up to write a declaration late at night, so he and his wife had a great big fight, and she made him sleep on the couch all night.
James Madison never had a son, and he fought the War of 1812.
James Monroe's colossal nose was bigger than Pinocchio's.
John Quincy Adams was number 6, and it's Andrew Jackson's butt he kicks, so Jackson learns to play politics. Next time he's the one that the country picks.
Martin Van Buren, number 8, for a one-term shot as chief of state.
William Harrison, how do you praise? That guy was dead in 30 days.
John Tyler, he liked country folk.
And after him came President Folk.
Zachary Taylor liked to smoke. His breath killed friends whenever he spoke.
1850, really nifty, Millard Fillmore's in.
Young and fierce was Franklin Pierce, the man without a chin.
Follows next a period spanning 4 long years with James Buchanan. Then the South starts shooting cannon, and we got a civil war.
A war
Down south of Dixie.
Up to bat comes old Abe Lincoln.
There's a guy who's really thinking.
Kept the United States from shrinking, saved the ship of state from sinking.
Andrew Johnson's next. He had some slight defects.
Congress each would impeach.
And so the country now elects
Ulysses Simpson Grant, who would scream and rave and rant.
While drinking whiskey, oh the risky, cause he'd spill it on his pants.
It's 1877 and the Democrats would gloat, but they're all amazed when Rutherford Hayes wins by just 1 vote.
James Garfield someone really hated cause he was assassinated.
Chester Arthur gets instated, 4 years later he was traded.
Or Grover Cleveland, really fat, elected twice as a Democrat. Then Benjamin Harrison, after that is William McKinley at the bat.
Teddy Roosevelt charged up San Juan Hill.
And President Taft, he got the bill.
In 1913, Woodrow Wilson takes us into World War I. Warren Harding next in line.
It's Calvin Coolidge, he does fine.
And then in 1929, the market crashes and we fight.
It's Herbert Hoover's big debut. He gets the blame and loses too.
Franklin Roosevelt, president who helped us win in World War II.
Harry Truman, weird little human, serves 2 terms and when he's done.
It's Eisenhower who's got the power from 53 to 61.
John Kennedy had Camelot, then Lyndon Johnson took his spot.
Richard Nixon, he gets caught, and Gerald Ford fell down a lot.
Jimmy Carter liked campaign trips.
And Ronald Reagan's speeches, scripts all came from famous movie clips. And President Bush said, read my lips.
Now in Washington, D.C.,
That's Democrats and the GOP.
But the ones in charge are plain to see.
the Clintons, Bill and Hillary.
The next president to lead the way, well, it just might be yourself one day. Then the press will distort everything you say. So jump in your plane and fly away.
Now let's take a step back and go back to the Constitution. Now, if you remember, the constitutional president is the commander-in-chief of military forces, which include the militia of the states when federalized, the National Guard today. The president can consult department heads. The president can grant pardons and reprieves. The president conducts the foreign relations of the United States, negotiating treaties, accepting foreign representatives, and appointing ambassadors. The president appoints officials of the United States government. The president appoints federal judges at the Supreme Court and all other federal courts created by Congress, though he is sometimes limited by senatorial courtesy, especially when it comes to the lower level federal courts. That means essentially appointing the person that the senators of the states which this federal court covers prefer. And the president takes care that laws be faithfully executed. And pretty much when it comes to foreign affairs and the appointment of officials of the United States, he has to work with the United States Senate. where he has to essentially get the advice and consent of the Senate. But that's pretty much it. Those are the powers of the constitutional president, which aren't that expensive as people think, and sounds a bit boring, frankly, almost like the job of the lady on the picture, the Queen of England. Only she gets corgis, the president doesn't get corgis. Poor Chester or Arthur got no corgis while he was president. I mean, the constitutional president is a very limited office compared to what is actually going on. So we need to understand in this class why what is on paper doesn't actually correlate to what is actually going on in reality. Because in reality, we see the president as an extremely powerful institution and powerful individual. And indeed, the US presidency initially had many of the characteristics of a head of state, an institution that symbolized the unity of the country and personified the values Americans believed to be uniquely American. So much so that the earliest patriotic songs like Hail Columbia had the role of the president as leader and symbol of the United States of America as a central theme. But the United States president isn't just the head of state. And that's where we start seeing the differentiation between the constitutional president and the actual presidency.
The chief who now commands once more to serve his country stands, the rock on which the storm will beat, the rock on which the storm will beat, but armed in virtue firm and true.
All of Philadelphia is at your feet. All of America sings.
When hope was
They think less in praise of me than they do in outrage at the mendacity of the French, Dr. Cumberland.
obscured Columbia's day.
No, they will turn again in a moment's notice, I have no doubt. A mob is no less a mob because they are with you.
On death or liberty, firm united let us be, rallying round our liberty, as a band of brothers joined, peace and safety we shall find.
You see, the framers did not set our system of government in such a way as to protect this exalted vision of the presidency from the everyday dirt and passions of politics. Unlike in many other countries, like Greece and the United Kingdom, for example, in the US, the head of state and the head of government is one and the same. In Greece, we have a president of the republic and a prime minister. And in Britain, they have the queen and a prime minister. In the United States, we have a president and a president. And the president pretty much acts like the prime minister does in a parliamentary system. And this has a huge impact on both the way we as citizens see the presidency and on how the presidents saw their task. And it's important to understand that the United States of America is only one of the few countries in the world that was able to pull this off in a democratic system of government. Most other places in the world, when you have the head of state being the same thing as the head of government, well, you tend to have authoritarian autocratic systems. It's very hard to pull it off because the concentration of power can be truly, truly impressive. But in the US, primarily because of checks and balances in the Constitution when it comes to other institutions, we have avoided that. But to be frank, many Latin American states have those checks and balances, like Chile, for example, but they ended up having civil wars that pitted on one hand the president as head of state and head of government with Congress as head of the legislature. So the US has pulled this off much better than everywhere else in the world, and that's why most democrats in the world try to avoid having the head of state and head of government being the same person. Now, it is important to understand that according to the written rules of this country, the Constitution, the president has no legislative power. They cannot make laws. So why on earth do we as citizens expect so much from the person who is the president? Everybody asks the president to fix this, fix that, to help end bullying, to forgive our student debt, to cut spending, etc., to make America great, to bring hope, to resolve racial tensions. I mean, why? Okay, we don't expect anything from James Buchanan. That's just his problem. But from every other president, we expect a lot. Well, one reason is that unlike congresspersons, as we're going to see, the president is nationally elected. Okay, it's a nationally elected office. Representatives, as we're going to learn, represent their districts. Senators, their states. Only as corporate bodies do the Senate and the House of Representatives represent national aggregations. And when those corporate bodies are riven by internal conflict and rivalries, as we accept them to be, because we don't agree on everything, they lose their national luster. That's why we hate Congress. The president, by default, is unlikely to be at war with him or her or themselves. Indeed, it gets more pervasive. Our representatives and senators, as individuals, have no incentive to address the nation. Who cares? The nation doesn't vote for them. Their constituency does. Only those with presidential ambitions or national roles, like the Speaker of the House, as we're going to see, do that. So the president has what is called a bully pulpit. They are the holder of the office that has both the opportunity and willingness to enact national policies. People expect the president to put things on the national agenda because the expectation is that the president has to be responsive to all of us rather than just some of us. It is in this situation that the opportunity for the president to enact a national policy agenda arises. Here's how it works. Congresspersons try to gain goods for their constituents, but if those goods are not part of a bigger national agenda, chances are they will not be able to get what they want. Why? Because remember, politics is about who gets what, where, when, and how. And those goods, the what, is always scarce. Otherwise, it wouldn't be taken care of with politics. So because the goods they want are going to be denied to someone else, and that someone else also has congresspersons, which will fight them on this. Consequently, the individual wants of congresspersons must be presented as part of a national agenda, something that gives something to all. If they are to be permitted or supported by a majority, someone has to tell people that, opening a nuclear power plant in northern Nevada isn't just something that is in the interest of northern Nevada, it is something that is in the interest of southern Nevada, of Idaho, of Utah, of California, and so on. Well, that's almost impossible for congresspersons to do. Congress as a body could do it, but they don't have any incentive to do that because everybody will want to get their own personal things for their own state or constituency. That is something the president can do. They can supply that national agenda. So we get the first actual political power of the president that goes beyond the constitutional reality, and that is national agenda setting. The president, using the bully pulpit, can put things on the national agenda and get people to support them. Sometimes the president does this through discussion with congressional leaders. They sit down, they negotiate, they bargain, and the president then comes out and says, together with important congressional leaders, this is something that we think is good for the country. And sometimes, many indeed, he uses the bully pulpit to directly sell a national agenda to the citizens, who then start pressuring their congresspersons to adapt to it. He bullies congresspersons through the electorate. He goes to the citizens and says, Congress isn't doing anything about this. My fellow Americans, you gotta do something about it. Get out in the streets, go and call them, bombard them, threaten them to lose the midterm elections. Make the life of your congresspersons miserable until they hop on into this national agenda. You can probably understand why many times congresspersons do not like the president. The president can also affect legislation through other means. Judges appointed by the president can interpret the Constitution in such a way as to promote the president's national agenda and thwart legislation the president does not like. Sympathetic courts. The president can execute laws in a way that renders some laws less enforceable than others. A classical example is adjusting how many resources the Department of Justice allocates to protecting specific laws from judicial challenges. The term executive power in the Constitution is ambiguous enough that the president can get away with a lot. What does it mean, executive power? The president can bypass a problematic Senate in international relations via executive agreements, a process of creating binding agreements between states that does not require treaties. This is a result of international law, and under the US Constitution, international law is part of the law of the land. The Vienna Treaty laws, for example. Finally and controversially, the president can issue executive orders that bypass Congress.
And finally, anyone who uses the terms irregardless, a whole nother, or all of the sudden shall be sent to a work camp.
The modern presidency has vastly evolved from what most of the framers envisioned. It's much closer to what Alexander Hamilton wanted than to what other framers wanted. Today, the president holds a lot of clout in politics. This started especially with the Great Depression, when a majority of Americans rejected the reaction to the Great Depression proposed by the more traditionalist President Herbert Hoover, in favor of the more robust interventionism embodied in President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. Ever since then, the president's office has been burdened by the high expectations of American citizens to get things done. In reaction, presidents and will-be presidents have proposed large-scale programs like the New Deal, the Great Society, and so on, promising to transform American life. This has led to two contrasting views of the American presidency. Some scholars argue that now we are in an era of imperial presidency, initially seen starting during the tenure of Theodore Roosevelt and the rise of the United States to the position of a world power, but especially becoming the case during the early Cold War and during the presidencies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Eisenhower, and so on. While others see the president as a friend who gets things done. So we have these contrasting views of the presidency that agree on one thing, which is the central role of the president in the American political system. A central role that, as we pointed out, is much more expanded than what the Constitution has in writing. One thing that adds to this engagement of the president with the public is the increased information presidents have today about public attitudes. Polls provide presidents with an indicator of how people view them without the need of holding elections and risking a loss. The ability of the president to hold media attention gives the president the possibility of adjusting their policy to the cycle effect of rising and falling popularity. And it will fall because to get elected, they promise much that they cannot give because they don't have the legislative power. Now, what are the tools the president has at their disposal in order to run the executive? Well, first of all, the whole bureaucracy makes up the executive, but we tend to differentiate between most of the rank and file bureaucracy in the United States of America and those bureaucrats that are appointed by each president during the turnover. The most important part of the bureaucracy that is under the control of the president is the cabinet. Now, the Constitution does not per se mandate a cabinet, but presidents have historically used them to assist in running the executive branch. Per the Constitution, all U.S. officials are appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate. Presidents use cabinet appointments as ways to, 1, reward party members that supported their election or assuage powerful intra-party opponents. For example, President Obama making Senator Clinton a Secretary of State. 2, to show a bipartisan image by awarding cabinet positions to people supported by the opposition party and sometimes even members of the previous opposition cabinet. 3, give a stigma of their position on key cultural political issues by appointing specific people to cabinets in order to, say something to the country about their view on things like women's role in politics, the role of minorities in politics, or specific foreign policy doctrines. And 4, get a person in the position who get the job done, somebody who knows how to manage and work with the rest of the federal bureaucracy. It can be very hard for presidents to get things done if they appoint cabinet members who are hated by the rest of the bureaucracy they're supposed to run. This especially used to happen with the CIA. Look at the tenure of President George H. Bush. Before that, he was at some point the CIA head. Good book on that is Legacy of Ashes by Tim Weiner. The president also has created a number of other offices, these ones directly under the control of the presidency: the Office of Management and Budget, the Council of Economic Advisors, and the National Security Office. The Office of Management and Budget essentially plays an important role because that is the office that helps the president collect information from the various cabinet agencies and so on and bureaucracies of the federal government in order to prepare the demands that he will make to the House of Representatives for a federal budget. Because remember, it's the House of Representatives that starts the budget process. So the president uses the Office of Management and Budget to get essentially a suggested bill to the House of Representatives. And usually he also discusses this with, or she or they discuss this with the Senate. The Council of Economic Advisors includes mostly volunteer academics, business leaders, and so on, who advise the president on a general economic policy. Well, the National Security Council brings together various agencies and bureaucracies that have to do with the United States military, defense, and international relations, and advise the president on the foreign policy. The most important job they do is produce the United States national security doctrine for every presidency that lays out the general ideas of the presidency. Again, these two, the Council of Economic Advisors and National Security Council, produce information that the president then uses to try to change the national agenda and justify the budget that he wants from the House of Representatives through the Office of Management and Budget. The president then also has the White House staff, which is made of the chief of staff, who is usually the person who ran the successful president's electoral campaign. He's also assisted by the vice president, whose only constitutionally mandated activity is to be the president of the Senate, where all he can do is vote when they're exactly tied in division. John Adams, the first vice president of the United States of America, called the vice presidency the most boring job on earth. And of course, the first spouse, which is not a constitutionally mandated position and generally takes care of some of the imaging and the running of the White House and so on. These positions, chief of staff and the first house, these are not officially federal bureaucracy positions, so they don't need to be okayed by the US Senate. Finally, the president has to work with Congress to get his agenda through. I mean, he literally has to work with the US Senate that was mandated by the Constitution. And Congress needs the president to sell particular agendas, that is, agendas that are important just to their constituencies but not be important to the rest of the country, as national agendas. The president has a special office for this, the Legislative Liaison Office, which he uses to persuade and indeed buy the votes of congresspersons. That is what Lincoln did to get emancipation passed. I mean, those three guys in the clip, they were the Legislative Liaison Office back then. And what do congresspersons sell their souls for? Many things. Positions in the federal government, presidential support for particularist and local projects, presidential support for election campaigns. The more popular a president, the more leverage he has. Now, we will talk about it more later in the class, but in the US political system, it is very likely that you get divided government. A system of checks and balances and separation of powers tends to foster that. That is when Congress, or at least one of the two chambers, is held by one party and the presidency by another. As we will see later in the class, this can easily lead to deadlock, which other political systems, like parliamentary systems in Europe, do not face. So that was the presidency. That is the presidency as it is in the Constitution. That is the presidency as it is in reality of political power. But it is important to remember that on paper, the US president is not as strong as many think, especially outside of the United States of America, but is strong primarily because Congress is divided. If Congress unites, the president largely becomes a decorative office in many ways, as was the case with the Ford administration.